Welcome to the afternoon session. I stopped teaching a year ago, so I've lost the art of turning on microphones. So I'll start again. So welcome to the afternoon session, everybody. And my name is Eamon O'Shea, and I used to do the job that Kieran Walsh is doing now for a good many years. So I'm an economist with an interest in ageing, and I'm very interested in the work of the conference of the last few days, particularly stuff on ageing in place and community, and even the title of today's talk is really interesting for me in terms of particularly the rurality issue. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Vanessa Burholt, whom I know and who has been here before for us, and whom is a friend of the Institute here and a friend of the country. She's Professor of Gerontology in the School of Nursing of Population Health at the Faculty of Health and Medicine at the University of Auckland, and is co-director of the Centre for Co-Created Ageing Research. She moved to her current position in New Zealand in October 2009, and previously in the UK she was Director of the Centre for Innovative Ageing in the College of Human and Health Sciences at Swansea University, and I think it still is. Certainly her work on the integration of transdisciplinary research on ageing and dementia, and is committed to co-production of research on ageing as well. She has published on dementia, on rurality, on social exclusion, on loneliness, on support networks, on intergenerational relationships, ethnicity and migration. And her work, she's been prolific in her work on older people throughout her long career. So, and since 2013 she's been a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in the UK. So welcome to Ness. So she'll speak for about 45 minutes and then we'll have a respondent, a Merle, and then we'll have a Q&A. So the whole session should last around 75 minutes, and we aim to finish up just slightly after 3 o'clock. So, floor is yours.
Thank you, Eamon. Kia ora. As a current member of the University of Auckland, I'd like to follow Te Kanga and do my pepeha for you. So, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Sisbury ta maunga, ko Aaron ta awa, ko Ngāti Pākehā ta iwi, ko Carriage ta whānau, ko Thomas Gooch ta tangata, ko Waipapa ta marae, ko Noworthing, England, ahau, kai te raki pai whenua taku kainga, ko Vanessa Burholt taku ingoa. Hei aharangi kaitiaki ka mātua ahau. No reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So as traditional in Māori language, I've introduced the place where my mountain is, my river, and where I live. Was born, originate from in Worthing. Also my family, just in case we're related, and a bit of my whakapapa back to the first ancestor we can trace in England. That kind of has importance for what I'm talking about today, because it's about a cultural context and contextualising some of our research. And I want to talk today about 4 interwoven stories over time. A little bit of that is my personal journey in gerontology. I want to look at the journey of gerontological theory over time and research, and then look at a rural context, how that's changed over time, and how support networks have changed over time. I'm particularly drawing on Wenger's network support theory, so I'll talk a little bit more about that, and a repeated cross-sectional study design. Comparing support networks at 2 different periods at time, so in 1993 to 5 and 2012 to 14. Finally, bringing together some of the contextualisation and the secondary data analysis of what happened in a rural area, I want to interpret some of those results about the social support changes over time and look at some of the implications maybe for future research. So starting with the timeline for gerontology, social support theory and research, back in the 1980s in the UK, the Barclay report was talking about how the state should work with informal caregivers, not to displace the support of what was happening in families for older people, but to supplement that support. However, there was some angst around this because earlier that century, Burgess had talked about what happened to family forms in the face of modernisation, and that they changed perhaps in shape from extended families to more nuclear families. Popenow also talked about the shift from families providing institutional support, so covering things from informational support, functional support, emotional support and financial support, to an institution that provided mainly emotional support. Around that time, we saw the development of some key support network material or social resources material. So there were key scholars such as Claire Wenger, who developed a support network typology, Jim Lubbock, who developed a social resources network scale, work by Tony Antonucci, who started looking at convoys of older people's relationships. And all of these scholars found that really there were families that were still supportive while social changes had happened, but there were also at the same time some people who were vulnerable with shortage of family support. In the 1990s, theory moved on a bit to take into account intergenerational solidarity theory. Vern Bankston was one of the key movers to develop that theory. At the time, I was working very closely with Claire Wenger, who developed a support network theory, and Merrill, who's the discussant, was working with Vern. And around that time, we looked at a comparison of support in the USA and rural Wales to see, in fact, if modernisation played out in the context of intergenerational solidarity. That really focused on the flow of exchanges within families. So that could be informational, functional, or emotional support between generations, so both up and down, where formerly we were, I think, really in the 1980s, it was focusing on older people as recipients of support. Around the same time as the intergenerational solidarity theory, we also saw the emergence of the life course perspective, which looked at how earlier life experiences might impact on the availability of social support resources in later life, or how transitions in life impacted on the availability of support and resources. Around that time, the sorts of research that were happening were very much looking at those micro-level trajectories of individuals' relationships over that life course and how they made change over time. By the 2000s, we saw a new paradigm, which was the active ageing paradigm. And this, again, took a more positive view of ageing. Again, not looking at older people as dependent, but looking at their contributions to society, either through civic engagement or their contributions in families and networks. So both as grandparents and civic movers, if you like, movers and shakers. However, similarly, at the same time, although this was a positive view of ageing based on a capabilities approach, political economy also suggested that it was a political strategy to shift the responsibility of ageing and health onto the individual. And that approach really didn't take into consideration some of the structural factors and exclusionary processes that impacted on people's access to social resources. And Kieran, following on from that, had a cost action through European funding that really focused on what some of those exclusionary practices were. And I worked with colleagues looking at exclusions from social relations, looking at as well as the micro level and life course transitions that would impact on someone's availability of social resources, but also the macro level structures that may exclude people. From the 2010 onward, we've seen a real cultural shift in the cultural script around ageing and a negative generationalism of older people, homogenising often older people into a single group, sometimes referred to as boomers, and then defined according to a perceived lifestyle. We saw some amplification of that around COVID as well, but it's placing often boomers as those that have against other generations that have not. In terms of social support, We could see that perhaps people place boomers as saying the social support you have in later life is due to your own lifestyle characteristics, perhaps hedonistic values or migration to seek pleasure in a particular new place, which places people away from where their families may be located. Alongside that, really the research at the time is focusing on the heterogeneity of family forms. So how families and networks have shifted over time and how non-familial bonds have become more important or as important as some of the familial bonds. So as I've mentioned, alongside that, some of the research level was micro-level longitudinal analysis that looked at the change and stability in individual support networks over time, so relating to those transitions around retirement, divorce or widowhood, relocating to a new neighbourhood or a new country, or often to a new living environment. So, for example, into residential care or into retirement villages in some cases. It could also be related to poor health, chronic illness, for example, stroke or dementia, or caregiving for someone who may be in poor health too, and those increased caring responsibilities impacting on the way you can develop or maintain support networks. There is another way of looking at those changes on support networks over time, and there is a whole range of projects that studies that look at cohort effects. And this is the differential impact of social changes on different birth cohorts of older people. So things like how policy change or rules, practices and customs may differentially impact on earlier birth cohorts than later birth cohorts. So this is different than period effects, where it's a period effect is a particular change that impacts cohorts similarly. So some of the work that has been on cohort effects has been drawn on large-scale epidemiological studies, and Bianca Suanet has produced quite a lot of analysis around the changes in support networks, the differences between early and later birth cohorts over time. The researchers tended to focus on how educational changes for later cohorts impact on their ability both to be geographically mobile, but also on their social capital. There is also appears to be an increased importance of these non-kin relationships over time, and some of the analysis also shows that those non-kin relationships are able to provide support into later life. And then another tranche of work really looks at those opportunities to develop more social relationships after you leave work. So at retirement, when you don't get tied down to being in an office every day, but that you can go out and develop the sorts of relationships that you want. But what I want to do today is talk about contextualisation. This is where specific local geographic or regional conditions differentially influence social structures, including social support networks. So cohort effects are really reliant on their generalisations being when social structures are similar. Social and cultural structures are the same. So if you're going to generalise, it has to be to a similar place or local conditions. Whereas what I'm looking at is how those local conditions are different, and contextualising empirical results can lead to different interpretations of those findings. In particular, Eamon mentioned that I've worked quite extensively in rural areas. And rural areas we talk about as having particular distinct challenges and opportunities that may differ from urban settings, and that can also influence how support networks are formed and maintained. So a few of those are that some areas are very geographically remote or isolated, and they may have limited access to health and social care. I was really lucky when I was in Galway on sabbatical that I got to do some work with Kieran and Tom Schaaf looking at rural remote islands and how the support networks and the relationships there were changed over time, and how people talked about those. There's also an expectation sometimes where if there is difficult access to health and social care services, that voluntary organisations, or kin or non-kin, will fill those gaps that are not met by support services. There are also differences in community ties from urban areas. And I've spent a long time, I think, trying to debunk myths about rural idyll and rural communities. But today I'm actually going to go back a bit and say, but in some cases there are differences in culturally community ties. And I think missing from a lot of the discourse so far is how culture really may impact on social networks and social support, especially where issues of language and traditions are deeply rooted. And those sorts of things that may be very local or specific tend to get missed out in large-scale epidemiological studies. I want to acknowledge Claire Wenger. Claire was my PhD supervisor and my mentor as an early career researcher. Back in the 1980s, well actually 1970s, Claire started one of the first, if not the first, rural longitudinal study. The study was started in 79, it spanned 20 years to 1999, and drawing on that data, Claire developed a support network typology. So this grew out of data from a rural area. I'm not going to talk about the Bangor longitudinal study of ageing, which is where that was from today, but instead two other studies. Claire was also a principal investigator on cognitive function and ageing studies back in the 1990s. This had a rural area in Gwynedd. Just to point out, because these are the only maps that I'm going to have today, Gwynedd is to the left of the picture there at the top of the left-hand side of the top of the map. Anglesey, which is another study site, is just above that, is an island. So my first job as a research assistant was actually working with Claire after the collection of this data and looking at some of the support networks for people with dementia at the time. 20 years later, I had the opportunity to be co-PI on a new CFAS study, a cognitive function and ageing study. We had the same centre in Gwynedd and Anglesey, a different set of people because a new sample was drawn, and another centre down in Swansea. But I'm using data from this study from Gwynedd and Anglesey because both studies use those populations. Both studies had the same population stratified random sampling from GP registers in the area, and it's a repeated cross-sectional design that drew on Claire's network typology. So I'm going to use that typology to look at the changes over 2 decades. But first of all, I want to look at the changes in places in North Wales over those 2 decades. So we can see what was happening on the ground, which may affect the ways that social networks changed or didn't over those 2 decades. So back in 1991, there were just over 60,000 people, older people in the population. 61,000 people in the population in Gwynedd. This didn't change very much over the 20 years. There was only a growth of around 600 people. But the age structure changed, and it's not perhaps what you'd expect to see of a rural area, because between the 2 study periods, it appears that the population got younger. We have around a third of the population aged 65 and over in 1991, and then in 2011, only a quarter of the population aged 65 and over. But if we try and look at that in more detail, we can see that some of that really does mask what's happening on the ground if we look at the top level statistics. So by 2000, there had been quite a substantial decline amongst those aged 20 to 29 in rural areas. And in fact, 5% of the age group 20 to 24 had left that, had relocated outside Wales during that period. In Gwynedd and Anglesey, there had been substantial outmigration of the younger population, leaving behind an ageing population. But this is masked because the university where the research was being done had an in-migration of 10,000 younger people. So it looks like the population is actually younger, but in fact, or proportionally younger, but it is accounted for by an influx of students to the area. So it's not the same people, that may be families. The younger people from the families are disappearing, and we have a different tranche of younger people coming in. The other thing that's happening locally is the proportion of second homes in rural North Wales. It's a particularly scenic area, very attractive to holiday makers. This is a picture of Abersoch, and the BBC noted back in that the population of Abersoch in Gwynedd jumps from around 600 people to 30,000 from the months of Easter to summer. So a huge in-migration of tourists. And I think Galway looks like it probably also has a similar influx of tourists. But house prices were incredibly cheap in Wales, and a lot of these holiday makers also bought second homes. So that's not the main residence. It's somewhere where you just go for your holiday and then leave it empty while you're not actually there. Prior to our two studies, the second home issue had become very important in Wales because it pushed the prices of local housing out of the range of affordability of younger people. So they had nowhere to buy. Part of Gwynedd is also a national park, so there's no opportunities to build new houses for younger people there. So between 1970 and 1991, Maybe and Glyndŵr, which is the Sons of Glyndŵr, held a firebombing attacks on second homes because they wanted some way of discouraging people coming into the area to buy these second homes. And in total, there were 295 firebombing incidences around Wales. The majority of those, and the red marks at the top of the map, are in Gwynedd and Anglesey. We can see from the statistics there that although only 1.6 of the housing stock in Wales was second homes, 80% of those were located in North Wales. So it was perceived as a large problem that really needed quite dramatic solutions. Over the period of the studies, the two studies, during the period between those, the proportion of second homes in Gwynedd reduced marginally, but those in Anglesey increased by a little bit. The importance of the second homes was really about, as well, the importance of Welsh culture. Welsh language is central to tradition and culture in Wales, and the heartlands of Welsh-speaking Wales are Anglesey and Gwynedd. They have the greatest proportion of Welsh speakers, and so the outmigration of younger people was really threatening Welsh-speaking and Welsh culture. So the three effects of the housing inaffordability, outmigration of younger people, and the threat to Welsh culture was what Maybe and Glyndŵr were really focusing on. Between the two studies, we saw a reduction in Welsh speakers in Gwynedd and Anglesey. But what was important to the local community was there had been some communities that were nearly entirely Welsh speaking, and those were then lost. Then these were due to the reasons we've already mentioned, outmigration of younger people. But there was also a decline in some of the industries which had traditionally hired people that were Welsh speakers, so agriculture and some of the industries in the area which were mining. There was also, at the same time, in-migration, as well as second homes. Some people were actually moving to the area, so there were in-migration of non-Welsh speakers to what are stunning and beautiful surroundings. I was one of those immigrants living there at this period. Other trends at the time were an increase in divorce, particularly for those aged 60 and over. So we saw a 73% increase of divorce for men and an 81% increase in divorce for women over 60. And secularisation. So the number of people who attended a place of worship declined over that period. And attending church and Welsh chapel, again, was a really integral part of Welsh culture. We also had changes in policies. So I mentioned earlier about the 1980s paper, which talked about not displacing informal care, just being able to supplement it. In the 1990s, we had the National Health Service and Community Care Act in UK. That was a multi-agency approach, which was meant to support the needs of older people. But in reality, it was never fully implemented because it wasn't resourced. So we're still at a situation where it was just a sort of supplementary effect where you could get services delivered. But 1998 saw devolution, and the National Assembly for Wales was formed. After that, there followed quite a lot of policy making because they had responsibility for health and social care. And in 2003, the Strategy for Older People was launched. This focused very much on a partnership between the public sector and the voluntary organisation. The difficulty is, of course, that voluntary organisations are often less well developed in rural areas, and there are fewer services then available to people living in those areas. So that's the context where I'm going to now present some of the empirical evidence of what was happening for changes in support networks over time. So first of all, a little bit about Wenger's support network typology. There are 5 network types defined in this typology, and they're named based on the availability of kin to older people. So the first 3 are based on the presence of local kin, so that's family-dependent networks, locally integrated networks, and local self-contained networks. And the other 2 types reflect that absence of local kin, so wider community-focused networks and private restricted networks. So just a very quick description of each of those. The family-dependent network has, as the name suggests, a primary focus on local kin. This is often for people who are in poor health and in need of support. There is usually very little community involvement in these type of networks, and needs are usually met by relatives. The locally integrated network we think of usually as the most robust type of network. So older people have local family and local friends. They're highly involved in community groups, and they're also involved in religious activities. So a person with this sort of network might say, we all know each other around here and look out for each other. And it's based on long-term residence in an area. The local self-contained networks, the smallest proportion of people have local self-contained networks. They usually have a local kin member, but it's not often a child. Quite often it could be a niece or a nephew. So it's often related to childlessness. There's very low levels of community involvement for older people who have this type of network. The wider community-focused network is related to in-migration. We used to talk about this as the healthy and wealthy immigrants. So older people usually then have distant relatives living more than 50 miles away from them, very involved in local community groups, but they make a distinction between who their friends and neighbours are. If I was giving a talk at a local community group about networks, you could pretty much guarantee that the audience would either be people with wider community-focused networks or locally integrated networks. However, wider community-focused networks do not have a lot of religious involvement, unlike the locally integrated networks. And finally, the most vulnerable type of network is the private restricted network. These people have no local kin, very few local friends, but often high levels of need. They can subsume 2 different types of networks. So it might be an older couple with very little community involvement, or it might be someone who's withdrawn because of ill health and lives alone. There can be a lifelong adaptation though, because there are loners out there who like their own company and may have had this for a lifetime, but on the whole it's people with high dependency needs. The network types are assigned based on the answers to 8 questions, which asked about the proximity of relatives and friends and frequency of interaction and involvement in community and religious groups. So the first thing I want to do is show you the changes between the first study in 1993 and the second study in 2012. And we see that in the changes in those items between the times. When I say changes, this is repeated cross-sectional, so it's a snapshot at 2 different points in time, not an individual's change in their support networks. So between the 2 studies, we see that people were living further away from their relatives or the nearest child. They were living further away from siblings. They were seeing people, friends less often, seeing neighbours less often, attending religious meetings less often, but were more involved in their community networks. And there were no differences between where their nearest child lived or how often they saw or spoke to their nearest children. We then looked at the classification of people into the networks at the first study and the second study, and looked at what predicted network membership at each time to see if there were differences between the two study points. So we found that in 1993, older women were more likely to have locally integrated, the most robust networks, than older men. Older age, having a high level of disability, or never having been married decreased the odds of having locally integrated networks. But importantly, and the highest odds are on each slide in red, living in the area for less than 25 years had 60% lower odds of having a locally integrated network than those who'd lived there 25 years. So very much related to long-term residence in an area and having that ability to develop those friendships, but also having your local family around. Family-dependent networks, there were differences between 1993 and 2012. So there were lower odds for women in 1993 than men of having these type of networks, and greater odds for those that were never married or widowed. That had changed. In 2012, we saw that older age marginally decreased the odds of having a family-dependent network, but marital status did not predict it. But in both samples, networks were predicted by lower levels of education, greater levels of residency in the area, and importantly, the highest odds were having high or moderate levels of disability. Locally self-contained networks aren't strongly predicted by any of those socio-demographic variables. We see a slightly lower odds of local self-contained networks for women in both samples, and in 2012, living less than 25 years in the area slightly decreased the odds for local self-contained networks. Finally, the wider community-focused networks. In both samples, this was consistently predicted by gender, widowhood, length of residency, and disability. And again, the highest odds were around living for fewer than 25 years in the area. So this is associated with immigration. High and medium levels of disability decrease the chance of having these network types. So these were healthy people with wider community networks. And finally, the most vulnerable network type, the private restricted network, in both 1993 and 2012, they were strongly predicted by length of residence. And this was living in the area for less than 25 years. Increased the odds of those networks by more than 4 times in the first sample and 2.3 times in 2012. Widowhood decreased the odds of private restricted network in 1993, and never married increased the odds in 2012. So what did those networks distributions look like between the two time periods? The yellow bars are CFAS Wales, the later cross-sectional study, and the blue bars are the distribution in 1993. We put all of the socio-demographic variables and study period into a binary logistic regression to look at the log odds controlling for those variables. And we see that the local self-contained networks were more likely in the later time periods, and the wider community-focused networks, there was a greater odds of those in 2012, but a decreased odds of locally integrated, so the most robust local, having lived in the area for a long time, networks. So, having got all the stats out the way, now let's try and contextualise that and say, actually, what was happening in those communities? What did we see on the ground that might explain some of these findings, and how could we interpret it? I do want to say, though, contextualisation is really what we would call a straw in the wind test. It's about, can we see some plausible reasons why these things may have happened? I can't suggest causality. And the same with the repeated cross-sectional analysis. We can look at trends, but we really can't look at causality because we're not looking at the same people over time. So just looking and thinking about some of those interpretations I mentioned earlier from the cohort studies, which do follow a birth cohort over time, they found that educational changes impact on support networks and put that down to that increased opportunity for social capital. That the retirement transition from employment to work might be an opportunity to develop more friendships. And there was an increase in importance of non-kin relationships that provided support. Now, not all of these are supported if we start to contextualise the study. The educational changes are perhaps more explained by the cultural norms within the area and long-term residency. So I'm just going to look at two areas, which is the geographic mobility, culture and support, and the role of family and non-kin in support. So one of the key points was an upward trend in geographic mobility. Older adults in 2012 lived further away from extended family, but they didn't live further away from their nearest child. It was the family as a whole. And those who'd lived in the area for more than 25 years had the greatest odds of the family-dependent and locally integrated networks than immigrants. If we think back to that contextual data and what Maybe and Glyndŵr were doing, we're trying to, if you like, restrict in-migration to the area because they wanted to retain their families in the area. They wanted to have housing where their families could stay there. So we could suggest that those long-term migrants were Welsh people who'd been there for a long time because their family forms also fit with some of those Welsh cultural normative beliefs. So families were larger, people remained living and working with the local community. There was an expectation when you married, you stayed in the community and to live within close proximity of the family. A picture there of some of my close friends up there. You know, he's got 3-4 generations now of families living in the same village. They're in a rural farming community. That's what they do. And I don't think any of them have actually migrated away. The role of the family in non-kin support. You remember the cohort study suggested that there was that friends would be there to provide support in later life. But our contextualisation of the study doesn't suggest that in this particular context that is the case. So back in the 1990s, Claire actually noted and found that the family-dependent networks were in response to the declining health of older people. So that locally integrated networks shifted to family-dependent when people were no longer able to access the community and be involved in community groups. When they needed care, the family stepped in and providing it. Lower levels of education and high levels of disability were associated with the greater odds of family-dependent networks in both of our studies, which suggests this may have held true across time, that still the local integrated networks, as people become more in need of help, they move towards family-dependent. Just suggests a trend. In terms of what's happening with non-kin, in the 2012 sample, there was a greater odds of being assigned to the non-kin network type, so wider community focus, local self-contained, and that decreased odds of having a locally integrated network. Wider community focused networks have a lower odds of being assigned to that network if you've got any disabilities. So I pointed out earlier, these are people that are healthy. What happens when you're in poor health? Because you're not carrying on having a wider community focused network because it's not associated with disability. So we can maybe assume that private restricted networks, which are also associated with shorter length of time living in the community, may be an adaptation from those wider community focused networks in the face of poor health and few proximal kin. So the private restricted networks are the ones where they would need, if you like, to be formal services to provide support for older people. They don't have non-kin available to them, and they don't have kin available to them. So it may be that those expectations of support from your friends actually exceeds what they would expect to do. So we're not talking here perhaps about, doing the shopping, but actually providing personal care and other sorts of tasks. And it also exceeds the ability of those distant kin over 50 miles away to actually provide that sort of care. So overall, some of those contextualisation of what happens in a very small level helps us understand what demographic trends, how they may impact on support networks over time. So while we see younger people moving away from the area and we see other older people moving in, there is that change in those family forms, and that results in different levels of availability for support, and indeed for older people providing support to their families. Cultural and social norms. Some rural communities may have these deeply rooted cultural norms and values. And I think we're really going to only understand those if we look at those communities, because this is the part that is really glossed over if we look at large cohort studies, because we can't drill down to those nuances. In Wales, for example, because of colonialisation in earlier birth cohorts, Welsh was not allowed to be taught at school. So you couldn't use Welsh language really as a predictor of having a Welsh cultural background, because you weren't allowed to speak Welsh. So how would you understand what culture someone felt was theirs and their identity unless you drill down and actually try and contextualise those studies? And in-migration as well has that different impact on how neighbourly communities may be. A big population churn means you're probably not likely to know your neighbours as well. Economic and policy changes are often may limit the economic opportunities in rural areas. For example, agricultural changes, where at one point in rural Wales they were looking to build large integrated farms. That wasn't the local farmers that were integrating, it would be incomers. So those sorts of changes may impact on social support resources. Housing policy. If there'd been a housing policy that said no second homes in this are allowed in this area, or if you do, you've got to rent out at reasonable cost, that may have impacted on local support networks. And finally, social cohesion and community dynamics. Some rural communities may exhibit higher levels of social cohesion and trust, especially if that is based on cultural roots and if long-standing relationships within an area. And those population dynamics then can change those sorts of structures. So future directions. I am not suggesting by any means that we don't need longitudinal studies and large samples to understand changes in support networks over time. However, I do think that perhaps we can consider how we look at how those may differ between rural and urban areas. And that's not a simple job at all, because we know, certain rural gerontologists know, that there are different settlement types, and we will want to be able to look at those different settlement types and look at the contrast between those as well. Cohort studies are a powerful means of looking at changes in successive birth cohorts in the family structures. But we do have to be aware that they are dependent on cultural and structural similarities for those generalisations to make sense elsewhere. Contextualisation then, thinking about how social and place changes could impact on the empirical research fundings, I think is really important to consider. And maybe there's a turn towards this in the future. I know yesterday Bianca Suanet was talking about loneliness and the way that we need to think about the meso-level factors and the macro-level factors, as well as other individual micro-level life course changes. And finally, as much as I've used the network typology throughout my life, my academic life, I think we have to think carefully about the history of typologies and the measures that we are using. So when Claire developed that typology, it was about face-to-face contact. It was pre-ICT digital communications. It was also based on very traditional family forms, and we've seen a lot more divergent family forms. So there may be more nuanced differences in that local self-contained network that we don't know about. And my takeaway message, I suppose, is we need to recognise those evolving social changes. Contextualising our research is really important to make sure that it is relevant and meaningful in the lives of older people who are experiencing those social and place-based changes. Thank you for your attention.
So, thank you, Vanessa. So now we're going to have our respondent, who is Professor Merle Silverstein. He's inaugural holder of the Marjorie Cantor Chair in Ageing Studies at Syracuse University. and in the Maxwell School's Department of Sociology and in Falk College Department of Human Development and Family Science. He received his doctorate in sociology from Columbia. He's published over 150 research publications in the area of ageing, the context of family life, emphasis on the life course, and international perspectives. He serves as principal investigator of the longitudinal study of generations and has projects in China, Sweden, the Netherlands and Israel. He's a Brookdale Fellow and a Fulbright Senior Scholar. And between 2010 and 2014, he served as Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Gerontology, Social Sciences. So he'll speak for about 10 minutes or so. And I think you're okay set up? Yeah, good, okay.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you, Ness, for providing such an interesting paper to read. I'm going to kind of go over some of the highlights and maybe give some perspective. But first I want to just say, and this may sound off topic to start with, but when I get asked by graduate students and emerging scholars whether it's worth coming to these kind of international scholarly meetings to present papers, I say yes, it is a great idea, not only for exposure to other scholars in the field, but also for the kind of connections that you can make at these meetings. So I say this because in 1994, 30 years ago, I was at the World Congress of Sociology, and my mentor, Vern Bankson, introduced me to somebody he had just met named Claire Wenger. I was a second-year assistant professor at the University of Southern California at the time, and Claire and I struck up a conversation, and we exchanged emails over a year or two. I wound up getting intrigued with the study in Wales and the network typology she developed. I received a small grant from the Brookdale Foundation, of which I was a fellow at the time. We made 3 or 4, when I say we, my wife and I made 3 or 4 trips to North Wales, where we met Ness. I don't know if you were a grad student back then, perhaps. And what came out of that was what Ness referred to as the LA-Wales comparison. And you can't really imagine a greater difference between rural Wales and urban Los Angeles, right? In terms of family dispersion, in terms of lifestyle, and many, many, many dimensions. So it's a little dangerous making these kind of comparisons because you never know what the operating forces are, right? Because there are so many differences. Nevertheless, we published an article in the Journal of Aging Studies, and you're all welcome to read this in Google Scholar or wherever your portal is. So just to summarize that, what I thought was one of the main findings from this study was that although the emotional connection to children was pretty much the same between Wales and Los Angeles, the adult children in the Welsh sample forged more intimate and supportive ties with the local children, where in LA, the content was the same in terms of emotion and support, but the children were really dispersed, maybe putting more of a burden on them in order to get closer to their older parents. But it really drove home how locality was so important within the Welsh context. And what we saw in Ness's presentation is that a child-centered way of life, as we might call it, the family-dependent network type, really declined significantly in the period that she studied. So really a dramatic shift in the kind of centeredness of the network style. Let me just back up a little bit and just praise the network typology that Claire developed and Ness followed through with. Because these network typologies are parsimonious and also intuitive representations of how we think of networks. We can think of networks as comprising a lot of different elements. We can think of, let's say, each tie in this diagram might be an element of a network, but we think of it in a cohesive sense. It becomes a much more intuitive way to consider. In terms of measurement, I think the measurement of the typology shows robustness over decades of time, which is very good for the science of social network analysis and aging. And also the focus on rural Wales, although it seems like maybe a niche area to study, it's very useful to develop tools, methodological tools, and substantive conclusions for advancing the science of aging on these kind of samples, these kind of regional and local samples. The National Institute on Aging in the US has developed or been using terminology to support what they call deeply phenotypic studies. And I was a little taken aback and maybe even put off by that, but what that means was sort of very deep dives, very highly focused studies on specialized samples. And I think this is a specialized sample in terms of its geographic region, its cultural content, and so on. But also in terms of the kind of measurements, these very detailed measurements. And we can get a lot out of these kind of studies. And so I'm all in favor of nationally representative studies, but they have to be very kind of measurements that are usually omnibus, right, across a variety of topics. And I think these kind of studies and networks are very important to do because you can drill deep into that topic and concept. One of the other things that came out, and this is probably true all over the world and maybe all rural areas in the developed world anyway, is that older adults are experiencing better health over the last several decades. They're better educated, less likely to be widowed, better cognitive status, and so on. And this got me thinking about my own study in rural China, where we found that in spite of, and we studied this over a 20-year period, in spite of the reduction of fertility in the families that we studied, going from 5 or 6 children to 2 or 3, there were fewer opportunities for the grandparents to provide care for their grandchildren. But these higher level resources, which we found also, extreme improvements in health and education and wealth and so on, gave them better capability to provide for their grandchildren. So we actually found an increase in grandparent care in spite of fewer opportunities to do so. And I wonder within Wales, the provision of services to family, even though there might be fewer of them local, might also show an increase. Also, what Ness mentioned, the preference for autonomy, what I call the new old age in terms of wanting to be self-sufficient, the hedonic retirement preference that we're seeing, and also emphasis on active aging, who could contribute to older adults serving their families and others in their community. And this led me to think about, especially with the migration back and forth, if rural aging is actually kind of merging with urban aging, right? There's maybe the blurring of the dichotomy between those two maybe makes it more difficult to isolate effects, but maybe makes it more interesting in terms of the kind of populations that we're studying. So what are the surprises from this study? Well, for me, the private restricted network did not change in prevalence. This is the type that's most at risk, I think, for future social precarity. And the wider community-focused network increased. And this, I think, somewhat has to do with in-migration. But it's very interesting to see how the cultural fabric has changed within rural Wales. The shift away from family-centered networks and toward more community involvement in some sense goes against the notion that we're experiencing, and I know this is true in the US, but also around the world, an epidemic of loneliness, especially in old age, deriving from social isolation. People seem to be connected. If it's not family, it's some other social object. I couldn't help but bringing up Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone. I don't know if you are familiar with this. He's mostly speaking about an American context here, but I think it applies around the world. So his idea of bowling alone is kind of the definition of social detachment and estrangement from civil society as a symptom of modernity, kind of responsible for kind of an underlying alienation that's given us the far right in the US and populism and so on. But it does not appear to be growing in rural Wales from the results Ness presented to us. The local self-contained network, the one which has the weak local ties, the weak solidarity with children, and includes the social isolates, increased significantly, but only modestly, really, from 6.9% to 8.7%. So I was wondering from which group might this increase evolve? Is there an evolutionary trend in networks from one type to another toward isolation or away from isolation and toward community involvement? And that's, of course, going to take longitudinal data to map that out. So to follow up on the bowling alone metaphor, Putnam's book was subtitled The Collapse and Revival of American Community. So he had hope that this could be reversed. And one can imagine, given Ness's results about the wider network type, of network, that volunteering, political participation, religious and social organizations might be key to counteract declining family involvement, and this, as she pointed out, over the last 20 years. But then a consequence of that may be what happens when people move into the fourth age of frailty and disability. Are those wider social networks going to collapse? Are they going to respond in a way that children or close relatives might in serving onerous needs of older adults when they move into the very late stages of life? So again, I think it's going to take longitudinal work, new surveys to kind of track changes in networks as they relate to macro changes within the local and larger society, and individual transitions as people move along the life course and experience health declines and other kinds of losses. So I'm going to end there, and I think I'll open it up for Q&A for Ness. Thank you.
So we have about 10 minutes or so for questions and answers, or for questions. So does anybody want to start the ball rolling with a question? We can pick it up from there, right at the top left. Yeah. Get that microphone to you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, for this very good presentation, also for your reflection, Meryl. And I think also what you mentioned earlier, Vanessa, I think, yesterday I also gave this presentation about life course and meso and macro context, and I think, we come from two different sides. So you come from the community studies, and I come more from the cohort studies. But I think we kind of come to the same conclusion that what is important is to also really look at change over time, but also seeing people develop within their context and the diversity in their experiences in communities. And I think I was wondering what you see as ways to move the field forward, because I think the cohort studies can show us like changes in mean levels, and it can show you over time, okay, how do the networks develop, etc. However, what it cannot do, it can put a veil over like structural differences also within the population, I would say, in different communities, but also how individuals within these contexts actually experience the structures that they deal with. So, I mean, I have several ideas about how you can improve that, partially by doing other types of data collections within communities over time, but also thinking more about mixed methods, for example, looking at the experiences of people, integrating theories on social exclusion and social change. But I was thinking also, like, what are your ideas about, kind of integrating these two streams of research into a better, 2.0, sort of say, contextualization of social relations?
Yeah, thank you, Bianca. I think I agree with you around mixed method studies, and it's something I've been grappling with, because I've been thinking, okay, mixed method studies are great, but you end up with a very small, usually qualitative sample, and you're relying on a small group of people talking about experiences. One of the other ways of doing that may be through engaging local knowledge as well. So I'm thinking about local history groups. Most communities or regions have people who are really interested in the local history, which includes the social history. And so rather than having to rewrite that or use it, it's using that as perhaps a secondary data source to contextualize at least some of the work, but drawing on qualitative alongside that secondary data.
Yeah, so it's actually linking the experiences to the social change, and also the other way around, because people also shape, the social change that they are involved in. I think also that could be acknowledged more. So thank you for the reflection.
So there's the methodology. There is a methodology of linking the empirical stuff with people's diary and the changes over time, and doing a chronological sort of event. But it's intensive, and you sit in alongside large-scale cohort studies. It's still going to be. I don't know quite how we tie it all up. I don't have an answer properly.
Yeah, thank you, Bianca. It's a good question. To do a proper cohort study, which includes individual change, would require kind of repeated sampling with replenishment, right? Refreshing the sample with new people so you can compare over time. but it also lengthens the time that you do the study. So you can kind of think about principal investigators following a life course, right, of cohort change. And I followed Bernd Bengtson from his 1971 study to now we have a 2021 sample, and we can do a comparison, but it took 50 years to do that. So but it's possible. But there are also qualitative work. I think I'm a big fan of that. And people can talk retrospectively about their own lives, about the lives of their parents and grandparents, and we can kind of gain some knowledge about what happened in the past from that.
Okay, thank you.
Another question or observation? Kieran? Back.
Oh, it's going to be a whole question from Kieran.
Thanks very much for such a wonderful talk, but also a really thought-provoking response. So thank you both. Just to say something around maybe the impact of COVID-19 and counter-urbanization in rural areas, and whether or not that has really impacted any trends that you're witnessing in North Wales, or whether you would foresee some impacts in the future. And I suppose in the context of rural Ireland, there's been efforts at different points for decentralisation, but it's actually been in that period of COVID-19 that a lot of people have actually decided to move earlier to rural areas and to actually set up remote working environments and everything else. And that has changed the composition of some communities. So maybe just a conclusion on that.
I can't, Kieran, because I haven't been in this country for the last 5 years. I have no idea what's happening in rural Wales at the moment, but it would be really interesting to see if those... I mean, anecdotally, there were stories of people going to their second homes, for example, so they weren't in urban areas during COVID-19, but I don't know at all what is happening in that, so I really can't talk on that behalf. Do you have an experience in US?
I don't have a personal research experience on this in rural areas anyway, but I know mortality rates were relatively high in rural areas, and so greater dispersion of people. We are, at least in our urban sample, studying internet communication, digital communication. We're developing the notion of digital solidarity as kind of a companion to Bernd Bengtson's model of solidarity. I don't know to what extent, in the US, internet service is sometimes spotty in rural areas, so maybe this is also a complicating issue as well. In China, where we do research, it's a black box because they won't allow us to ask questions about COVID-19, or we weren't allowed to in 2021. So we can kind of look maybe at change that occurred in rural China in our sample across time and see if there was some kind of deviation in 2021 after we go into the field next year. But I think we really don't know the answer to that question, at least I don't.
I think just a quick comment. So I mean, what seems to be happening in some parts, particularly at European policy level, is there's a concentration of rural areas in terms of looking at them as being advanced demographic aging profiles. So it's almost a problematization of rural areas, problematization of them in terms of rural infrastructure and telecommunications infrastructure, and yet digitalization is seen as being kind of see it in there.
Yeah.
So it seems to be something that needs to be unpacked a little bit if we want to have meaningful interventions of policies actually support people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can't answer about rural Wales, but I can say a little bit about rural New Zealand. And one of the issues that, we were talking about how much civic engagement increased in voluntary organisations. A lot of the rural areas in New Zealand were reliant on voluntary groups to deliver services to rural areas. But a lot of their volunteers were older people, so the digital exclusion aspect also meant that some volunteers were not willing to learn new ways of working with clients, if you like, and so there was a dropout, a decline in the number of volunteers that were developing. So I think the way that we've relied on people to, for example, supporting people with dementia, it was down to a spouse then with no support potentially from voluntary groups or from the health sector who were not taking on new clients. We've really got to rethink how that works out in rural areas, I think. So yeah, that's an issue.
Anybody else? Can I just, in the talk about the fourth age, and the people who are at the sort of later stages of life who need strong health and social care, who are frail and so on like that, and how we deal with that from a public policy point of view, particularly for informal care networks, family networks in particular, are diminished or lower, because at the moment the substitution between state and family in rural areas, the families do a lot of what's going on for the state because rural services is weak. And my concern would be how to incorporate policy for rural dwellers, particularly those who are aging with frailty, if some of the distributions you're talking about are happening, that there'll be a weakening of ties to community and volunteering, and families simply won't be there or able.
Yeah, and I think that's really what the if the family dependent network is the one that results from if you've got high levels of need, you were locally integrated, but you've got local family, you're okay. And if you haven't, then you either become private restricted, and how do you identify those individuals? If they are, see, there was no evidence that they were better educated, the private restricted network. So that makes me think, maybe our sample didn't capture them. Maybe those people who had high levels of disability actually moved out of Wales back to where their children were, or moved into residential care, or moved somewhere else. And the people that remained in the community were the people that needed services, but those services are quite stretched and restricted, and I don't know that there is a huge amount of effort going into actually identifying people.
I go back to a model that my advisor developed with Chuck Langino back in the 80s, kind of a three-stage move of migration where older adults are moving, for the amenities in the U.S. would be to the south, Sun Belt, and then when they experience disability, move back north. So I don't know if that'll be true among the migrants to rural Wales, if that migrant community is sort of less tied to place, and more likely maybe their children live elsewhere and they can move back. I don't know if that's practical or not, but that is kind of the general model that evolved in terms of movements of older adults in the U.S.
Yeah, just one of the things in Ireland is that private nursing homes were increasingly private and highly equity driven are no longer locating in rural areas because it's not profitable, and so you're losing private production of health and social care as well as the weakness of public social care. So I think we certainly have an issue in that's looming even larger for people who are left, particularly in remote rural areas.
Yeah.
Anybody else? We have maybe one last question.
I just want to add on top of that and share my reflections this morning, or field trip to CRO, the social enterprise. And one thing that struck me with the discussion was not only do the older adults order food, but the enterprise actually do like weekly phone calls, and we were there, they kept calling the residents, and that was like a form of welfare check. And it was just so inspiring that it's not only providing nutritious, healthy food, but they're checking up on the residents and they're forming their own community. And I just want to get your thoughts, if you work in rural and big cities, how come it works well here in Galway? And do you think it could be expanded to other kind of rural areas in different countries or big cities?
So I wasn't quite clear what this is. Is it a network that's set up by an organisation as a peer support?
Yes, just a trip this morning. So social enterprise. They're making food here in Galway for older adults, and they're delivering to people who want them. So it's lowering readmission rates to hospital, and they can order the food they wanted. And it would just work so well. I was curious if you have like feedback on why it works well here, and that could be translated to other countries.
Well, I know because I lived in the rural communities I've been talking about today, I know certainly there was, informally, there were systems that were set up because people knew who lived in the community. So local pubs in the rural communities would set up meal delivery, or people didn't order, actually. I think it was actually delivering to them. So I don't know when they placed the order, thinking about it, not quite sure. But the technology side of things, I've used the same data to look at how people were using technology to connect. And older people are, on the whole, quite able to choose what and how they wanted to connect with people. And if they were used to using the phone, they were quite happy to pick up a phone and ask, their neighbours or their friends to where they're going to meet or what they're going to do. I think sometimes we try and find solutions to issues that aren't necessarily there. I don't know. If people are connected within a community, then there are avenues they can use to keep those connections and keep them, to find a place that might deliver their food. I think, as Eamon pointed out just now, is the most vulnerable group, like the private restricted people, whom are probably not connected to organisations already, and how we connect or enable them to feel more connected and be able to do the things they want to do, order the things they need to order. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm really one to answer from my personal experience in rural America, but because I've lived most of my life in Los Angeles and New York, but I do know that local governments provide home-delivered meals on wheels. And they not only serve nutritious meals, which is important, we had a discussion yesterday about food deserts and so on, but they're also checking up on whether older people are doing okay in their homes and what their health status might be, and if they're experiencing really catastrophic problems, and then reporting back to the agency. And so these are managed by local area agencies on aging. Each community in the US has an agency that's assigned to it. So it's as close to a kind of universal program as we have in the US. It's decentralized, but it's important. And I would also add, maybe this could be privatized. A lot of people are getting their groceries delivered now. And maybe those folks, right, can also serve a similar function.
So I think we better finish here. So just again to thank Vanessa for her presentation. Thank you for listening.
Oh.